Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to a special Daily Friends Show episode where we are wrapping up the year 2022, what it has been, and what to look forward to in the next year. And we're going to be looking mainly at South Africa, but we may also venture abroad a little bit. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and today I'm joined by Dr. John Endres, the CEO of the Institute of Race Relations. Thanks for coming on, John.
Thank you for inviting me, Nicholas.
So we did one like this last year. Where you and Dr. Franz Crinier were both on. He was outgoing as CEO at the time. You were incoming as CEO. So I guess first question, we didn't actually talk about this before the show, but how's it been in charge of the Institute of Race Relations for this year? Have you enjoyed your time so far?
Well, I think November last year seems like it is ages ago. I can barely remember doing that show. It has been extremely busy, and I think that is, in the nature of this kind of job, it does make quite significant demands on your time, on your concentration as well, and especially for an organization like the IRR, which is active in so many different spheres. There's certainly no risk of boredom setting in, but at the same time, it's also a tremendously stimulating and exciting place to be working and to be leading. So I'm very happy about that.
Excellent stuff. All right, let us get into the year that has been. Now, there's a couple of, I think, big things that we probably need to talk about as what happened this year. We were briefly brainstorming before the show. And I think for us, one of the very important big ones here, let me start with two that I think are sort of a bit related. The one is that we've really seen now a hard push to make expropriation without compensation and the subsequent erosion of property rights. It's now gone through the legislative process and looks pretty much certain like it's going to end up being made the law of the land. And the second one, and I think this is connected to that one, is that the perception is setting in not just amongst the sort of think tanky crowd and the sort of center and center right crowd, but more broadly in the mainstream. I think the idea that the ANC is really in big trouble and is doomed perhaps in the next election to falling below 50% when 2024 rolls around. So let's start with expropriation without compensation. Is it a done deal now? I believe it still has to be signed off by the president. Do you think he's going to do that? And what will the consequences be in the short term for South Africans?
I think what we've seen so far is that many people are under the impression that the risk of expropriation without compensation went away when the attempt to change the constitution to allow for it failed in December last year. And we are a little bit concerned that the public and also the media doesn't seem to be alert enough to the fact that the risk has not gone away. The danger is still around. In a way, maybe it's even more dangerous than before. And the reason for that is that the threat is now not concentrated in one single place, like a constitutional amendment, but rather spread out across various pieces of legislation, of which the expropriation bill is only one. And there are four pieces of legislation that are of concern to us in this respect. So that would be the expropriation bill and the land court bill, which are two pieces of legislation that were passed by the National Assembly, I think about a month ago, within a day or two of each other, and which are now in the process where they would need to be passed by the National Council of Provinces.
I was really struck by that passage because often things take ages to go through Parliament. They really can drag. We've seen that with the changes to the Electoral Act, which is maybe also something we could briefly touch on, which dragged on and on and on, and then a deadline that was set by a court was passed. But when it came to Land Court Bill and the Expropriation Bill, Parliament acted with a speed and enthusiasm that I don't think has been seen for a very long time. And I think that really gives us an insight into what the ANC really cares about in terms of its policy goals.
Well, it's, I think also important for Mr. Ramaphosa's own electoral prospects to be able to demonstrate that the 2017 resolution of the ANC to enable expropriation without compensation be realized, be brought to bear. So he, going into the elective conference of the ANC in December, the 16th of December, I think it starts, he wants to be able to say, look, this process is still alive. It is moving. Just look at the National Assembly, which has just passed these two pieces of legislation. It's going to go through the next few steps pretty quickly as well, of which the first is the National Council of Provinces, and the second would be then the signature by the president. So I think he'll be quite happy to be able to demonstrate some movement on these topics, which are so important to the party. And that would explain why they got rushed a little bit a month ago with a view to those elections, because otherwise the president would have gone into the election empty-handed, effectively having to concede that the 2017 resolution was not enacted, and then there was no movement on it. So I think that explains part of the reason for that, Nick.
So when you said electoral prospects, you're of course speaking only about inside the ANC. I think the polling that the IRR has done shows that the enthusiasm for land redistribution is not nearly as intense as some of the commentary suggests that it might be. But also, just as they're moving towards something like expropriation without compensation, the ANC is falling faster and faster in the polls. We've had polls now which put them anywhere between 49% of the vote and I think some on the lower end saying even 41%. There was even reported by, I think it was either Rapport or Beeld this year, it was one of the Afrikaans papers, that the ANC in one poll was presumably an internal DA poll, so who knows how robust it is. Because if it was released for the public like that, but that the ANC dropped even below 40, I think, in one of those polls. So expropriation without compensation, there's a theory out there that this is going to be what turns the ANC's fortunes around, that the people of South Africa are going to embrace it again. But I think we can say that that's probably not going to be the case.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think there is probably some support for expropriation without compensation. But I don't think it is very widespread. At least, our polling doesn't indicate that it is terribly widespread. So it is very much as you say, that the purpose of pushing it was for internal party political reasons of Mr. Ramaphosa's, rather than in communication with the greater public. And as you say, the party's been dropping quite fast, and I think that was a prediction we made last year, where we said, the significance of the ANC dropping below 50% in the local government elections goes far beyond merely, being 3.5% below 50. The impact of that was to trigger a process, I think, of tarnishing the aura of invincibility that long surrounded the ANC, both in the minds of the public, but also in the minds of the ANC itself. And so that self-doubt is now beginning to creep into the party itself. We've seen that in the policy conference document, which explicitly recognizes the danger that the ANC might drop below 50. I think that is not being denied or disputed by even the ANC itself. And the same applies to members of the public as well, who would have looked to the ANC as being the movement that unites almost all South Africans. That was the claim of the party, and that unites huge levels of support, very large majorities behind it. And that isn't the case anymore. And so as a voter, you look at that and you say, well, if the ANC is just a normal party, an ordinary mortal, so to speak, then I might also consider voting for a different party. Maybe it doesn't have to be the ANC. I thought that was a very interesting process, and probably one that is going to continue.
I think we really see that in some of the findings from the polling, which suggests that majorities of the country, including a lot of ANC voters, actually want a coalition government to run the country. There's almost kind of unanimity to some degree amongst South African people that some sort of coalition government would be good for the country, which is really weird, because it makes you wonder how long the ANC has been running on this kind of inertia of being the biggest player in the room and using that to just sort of squash the opposition.
And I think for a long time, the ANC could run on the argument that the jury is out on the effectiveness of its policies. And that enabled it to say time and time again, just give us another chance. We're going to try harder. We're going to try better. We'll be, less corrupt. We'll fight corruption more stringently. And voters did believe that in many elections. But I think, those promises are now beginning to wear thin. And voters are really now expecting to see a bit more delivery. So where the jury was out before, I think now the verdict is in, and the verdict says that the ANC is not delivering. That is what the voters are saying. I think that's what the party also recognizes. And that is one of the very important reasons leading to its weakening.
So I think one of the other factors has been that the ANC is very good at renewing itself. It's had this, or at least its perception of itself, right? So even though necessarily the policies haven't changed that much, the ANC was very good when it hit its first sort of speed bump with the global financial crisis, 2008, and the AIDS denialism of Mbeki. It went on this program of kind of selling Jacob Zuma as a man of the people, as an ANC that was going to be in touch with people, away from the sort of decadent intellectuals of the past. And for a time, Zuma was relatively popular amongst South Africans. And when he began to drag the party down, when his control of the party threatened its electoral processes, there was this another sort of false dawn where suddenly Cyril Ramaphosa was hailed as the great new hope who was going to change things, turn the country around. This is the new ANC. This is the real ANC. It's come out now. But that doesn't seem to have borne out. And I just want your thoughts, firstly, on that idea, and secondly, on the big problem that I think Ramaphosa and the ANC, who I think relies on him a lot for their remaining supporters' support, and the Phala Phala scandal, which doesn't seem to be going in Cyril's favor. And that's quite interesting, because you'd think that he would be able to deal with a scandal like this. It's not obvious why he's being so evasive.
Yeah, it becomes harder and harder to avoid the conclusion that the reason the president doesn't speak about Phala Phala is because his legal advisors told him not to speak about it. And the reason they would have told him not to speak about it is because there is, some reason for concern there. So his being so quiet, I think, looks more incriminating by the day. Of course, his opponents in the party know that as well. And what I find fascinating going into the elective conference, and I think was pointed out in an editorial, I think in Business Day, that we spoke about earlier, is how the ANC seems to be utterly self-absorbed going into this conference. It's a bun fight. It's about positions, who gets what position, and how many nominations each person gets. But what we've found to be lacking is, on the one hand, a discussion of policy. How do we turn things around in South Africa, which are clearly not going well? And secondly, also, how do you save the party? Like if I was at the head of the ANC, looking at the polling numbers, looking at the trends, looking at the economic data, I would say, this is an emergency situation. And, the candidate who has to be elected in December has to be the candidate who can change this, who, is very determined, ruthless, and able to dictate the change of course that the party needs in order to save itself. And we're not seeing any of that. There seems to be a strange sense of, they seem very relaxed and comfortable, despite the existential threat which they are facing as a party. And that is quite remarkable.
This is something that continually amazes me, because you look at a country like the People's Republic of China, right? They will crack down on corruption. Now, it's usually used as a tool by which to just get rid of your opponent in the political system. It's not a genuine sort of adherence to law and order. But the tool is at least used, and the perception is pushed out there in the public that, no, look, we really are cleaning up corruption. And here's the ANC, which continuously does odd things entirely because, as you say, it just seems to be so focused in of itself. I think of how Bheki Cele, who has continued to disappoint as a police minister, when we're seeing crime rates kind of going back to, I think, close to where they were in the 90s, is kept on as police minister, even though he has all these sort of gaffes and scandals and just silly moments. And also, this week we saw Shibia Sheikh and Jacob Zuma blatantly out in public, even though they're supposed to both be on death's door because of medical parole. They were released from prison on medical parole, partying the night away in KZN. And the ANC knows, presumably, that this is hurting their public image. This is hurting their electoral prospects. This is going to drive them below 50%. But they don't do anything about it because it's more important that we manage the internal factions. Do you agree with that sentiment?
Yeah. And, you can speculate about the reasons for it. Like there seems to be a sense of almost lethargy about, doing something about this. But maybe it's also, that as a party that's been in power for so long, you get very set in your ways. And it becomes hard to think outside of the channels that you're used to thinking in. And so you keep doing what you've been doing, and you talk about candidates and this slate and that slate. You worry about votes being bought at conferences, probably not without reason. But while you're focusing inwardly, you're neglecting the outside world, and the outside world is out there waiting for you, and it's not as friendly as it used to be. So yeah, I think the ANC is heading towards some sort of wake-up call. Maybe it will still experience that. Maybe we just haven't seen it yet, but who knows? Next year, maybe there will be a decided shift to do something about the declining electoral fortunes on the part of the party. From who I don't know, but unexpected things do happen.
So I believe it was at the beginning of this year or the very end of last year that you and many others at the Institute, but I think it was originally your thesis that what was going to take down the ANC was the so-called Wild Dogs Coalition. This was a phrase you used to describe all of the mess of not very unified parties that were opposite the ANC, which didn't really like each other, didn't always have that much in common with each other, but had enough to be able to potentially work together to pull down this larger creature called the ANC and replace it with not so much having one party dominance, but rather having this much more complicated electoral and political scene going forward. So I guess the question to be asked is, firstly, do you think that the Wild Dogs thesis was very much, do you still stand by it? Is it coming together, do you think? And secondly, how have the Wild Dogs done this year? What's your thoughts about that?
So looking back, I think that the metaphor was maybe quite well chosen, in the sense that a pack of wild dogs isn't perfectly coordinated at all times. But there is playtime, and there's fight time, and there's battling over scraps of food time. And we've seen all of that, So I think at the beginning of the year, we sort of were, I think our expectations were maybe exceeded in terms of the wild dog parties forming coalition governments in Johannesburg and Ekurhuleni, for example. And I think that towards the middle of the year and end of the year, we've seen our expectations being brought into a more realistic line with what we should have expected, which is that making coalition parties cooperate is very, very difficult. It is a steep learning curve and a very difficult process that they're going through. And it was to be expected that there would be fighting and dissolution of coalitions, the breaking apart, the reforming of coalitions. It's a messy business. And that is pretty much what we've seen. I think we'll continue seeing that extend into 2023. But as the election 2024 gets closer, the hope is that the coalition parties will behave like a pack of wild dogs that gets the scent of a weakened but a very juicy buffalo into their nostrils and is able to focus on taking down the buffalo. It really is a question of concentration and focus on knowing what you want. And I think the coalition parties, they're gradually getting to that point. It's been fascinating to watch this year. That I think the thought processes are in place and they are taking place, but it does take a long time.
So I think we've seen sort of two chunks of evidence. On one, you've got mostly, to be honest, the DA and Action SA fighting with each other. And while most of that, the vast majority of that squabbling has been rhetorical, there have been a few disagreements that are substantive. For example, the selection of who was going to be the new city manager for Johannesburg, the proposal to pursue some independent power options for the city of Tshwane. And also, I think Action SA is withdrawn from the Ekurhuleni coalition now in its entirety, although they're still sort of voting against motions of no confidence and voting against the ANC. So they're kind of half in, half out there. But on the other hand, you've also had the fact that, as you say, we've had these governments formed all over the place, even though in some cases there weren't formal coalition agreements. And we've also seen interesting developments from some of the parties. We've seen places where, for example, the Freedom Front Plus did not put up a candidate in a ward election and in fact endorsed the DA so that the coalition would have a better chance of winning. And we've seen the same thing in KZN, where the DA didn't put up a candidate because it endorsed the IFP. And I think that by-election is still to be had, so we don't actually know if it's going to work. But Do you think that we're really seeing that the development of those new behaviors, the growing of those new muscles that will be required for coalition government?
Yeah, I think those are good examples. And I think that's exactly what it is. What we're hearing from the coalitions as well within Johannesburg and Ekurhuleni is that on the whole, cooperation actually worked very well. So across most of the parties, they worked effectively together. They did figure out how to make it work. And there were the occasional exceptions. So Actionist ADA find it difficult to work together, even though they both recognize the importance of doing so, at least in public statements and so on. And what we also saw was some defectors, which was also to be expected. So I think it was the COPE representative who defected out of the coalition, and I think 2 IFP councillors.
Colleen Makabule, I think is her name.
Yes.
Maybe misremembering her surname, but she's definitely
Makubele.
Yeah. So and COPE is actually quite sad because they really seem to have sort of fallen apart now. You'd think that a party would be able to discipline one of their members who had gone rogue like that. But so far, she still remains a representative of the party.
Yeah, and I think the IFP councillors, I think, were dismissed from their parties, from the IFP, sorry.
Yes, and I think the ACDP also, in an instance, had some defecting councillors who it disciplined.
And I mean, these are good signs. This is sort of really coalition parties working the way they should, and being sometimes exposed to rogue actions, but then taking the appropriate steps to stabilize the coalition if possible. We saw also, was it the Patriotic Alliance, I think, which broke out of the coalition in Johannesburg and crossed over to the ANC. So that was a really opportunistic behavior of a kind that you probably should also expect to see from time to time. But what is interesting there as well is the voter reaction. So I do think that voters, they're not blind. They're also not stupid. They see what's going on, and they might say, look, that's not what I gave you a mandate for, to keep crossing the floor. No, I put you there because I want you to do certain things for me. And if through a coalition is the way that works, then you'd better get it done. Otherwise, you're not going to get my vote again. So I think it's very important not to ignore the importance and the role of the voter in this whole coalition scenario. They are very, very important, and they can show their elected representatives what they want and what they will condone and what they will not accept.
I think something that would be, to me, a very positive development, and we may even see the manifestos coming out, I think, towards the end of next year, depending on when the election for 2024 is called. But that particularly the smaller parties actually will be very explicit in their manifesto which political parties they're willing to work with and which political parties they're not willing to work with. I think that would be a very healthy development for our coalition politics, because then voters would actually be able to say, okay, well, I'm going to vote for this party partly because I like them, but also partly because they're going to support the bloc that I like. Although all parties should probably do that, because we have heard talk, for instance, much discussion about particularly the bigger parties like the DA. Some have suggested that they go into coalition with the EFF to secure some of these councils. And some have even suggested that come 2024, to block the EFF from government, that the DA should go into coalition with the ANC to keep the EFF out of government. What do you make of those suggestions? And do you think that they have there's any popular demand for such a thing?
Yeah, that's really the big question of 2024 is going to be what the 3 big parties do, and who works with whom and who doesn't work with whom. And within that constellation, I think the ANC-EFF combination is the one that is probably quite off-putting to many people. And not least, it should be off-putting to the ANC itself, which I think would be posed, it would pose a severe risk to the ANC to bring the EFF into a coalition with it. And I'm sure that some people in the ANC are aware of that, maybe not all of them, but certainly some are. If you look at the DA-EFF coalition, my hope is that is an option that is off the table, because they are, in terms of their orientation and their principles, just too far apart, I think, to form a successful coalition. Even if the purpose is to get the ANC out of power, would they be able to hold it together? And I think probably not, given the animosity, the hostility, and the complete lack of overlap between those two parties. When it comes to the ANC and the DA, that is an option that's been raised from time to time, very tentatively, and I think with good reason. So the hesitation is justified, because, of course, the ANC has been the cause of so much trouble in South Africa, corruption, incompetence, bad policies, and it's brought us into the point that we are at now as a country. And what is the DA voter going to say if the DA goes into coalition with the ANC, keeps them in power, holds them afloat a little longer for this mess to continue? It seems from the polling that some ANC supporters are quite supportive of the idea of an ANC-DA coalition, for the reason that they recognize the shortcomings of the ANC and hope that those would be compensated by the DA. And whether that hope is realized or not, is another question. But my sense personally is that the DA, if it were to cooperate with the ANC, should do so only at a certain arm's length relationship. So I think as long as the ANC is the larger or the dominant partner in such a relationship, it's not going to work out. I think that the pathologies and problems that beset the ANC would soon spill over into the DA, and the DA would be toast. In a constellation where the DA is in a confidence and supply agreement with the ANC, maybe that could work, just in the interest of keeping the EFF out, maybe. And finally, a constellation where the ANC splits apart or loses some of its better parts, and those better parts going with the DA, that could also work. So I think a coalition with the ANC is the smaller partner, that might work. It would give some legitimacy, I think, to the Wild Dog coalition. And if there's goodwill there in terms of working together to fix the problems, that could be quite a good option.
So we've also, let's move abroad now for a bit. It's been an eventful year on the world stage. You can look at every decade and say, oh, quite a few things happened. But I really think that this decade is already shaping up to be extremely eventful. Some of the most eventful of at least this century and possibly the last quite few decades. I would think that some of the big things we're seeing now on the world stage are, of course, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which has dominated an enormous amount of geopolitical thinking over the last year. But we've also seen some of the largest protests we've ever seen in Iran, and it's not clear what the outcome of that will be yet, but they are continuing, and they are maintaining, or in some cases even growing, their size. So there's a possibility that the Iranian regime could be overthrown, which would also once again sort of reshake up the whole geopolitical calculus. And we've seen some major protests in China, which is unusual because, especially in China's sort of economic cores like Shanghai and Beijing, you don't really see massive protests taking to the street, particularly more protests which are demanding an end to the control of the Communist Party of China. So just, John, your thoughts on all of those. What is your takeaway from the year we've just had? What are the big questions that are facing us on the global stage, and how does this relate back to South Africa?
Well, we came through 2020, and we're happy to survive that, which unfortunately, of course, many people did not. Into 2021, and then thought 2022, we're slowly getting back to normality, and that turned out not to be the case. This has been a wild year. As you mentioned, three of the sort of properly repressive authoritarian states in the world, Iran, China, and Russia, would not have been top of my list of countries to experience an awakening of civil society and large-scale protests against the authorities. Yet that has happened. Whether they have legs or not is another question. And if I had to rank these three countries in terms of the greatest ability of the authorities to suppress the protests, I'd probably put China right at the top. It's just a very controlled society. Russia in second place, and probably Iran in third place. So out of the list, probably Iran is the one that's looking the shakiest. And maybe we'll see a political change coming in Iran, which would, as you say, reshape politics in the entire region. And that would be fascinating to watch. China, as you say, protests have been a very rare occurrence in China for a long time because of the levels of control exercised by the Chinese Communist Party. But the fact that they are now erupting, I think, is a reflection of the pressures that ordinary Chinese are facing and the unhappiness with the leadership, where for a long time the implicit agreement was that you give up your freedom as a citizen, and we'll make sure the economy grows and your prospects improve your life gets better from year to year. And that equation, that agreement is now being questioned because growth is slowing down. The lockdowns have been, I think, really harsh in China. It's been extremely hard on the Chinese people.
Right.
And
This
they're
year
now
we
at the point.
saw a whole blocks of Shanghai shut down when no one was allowed to leave their houses. I think
Yeah.
maybe once a week or something to buy groceries.
Yes.
Enforced by drones and heavy police presence on the street. It's been COVID lockdown of a level that would shock the rest of the world. And it's continued when the rest of the world has kind of moved on from COVID.
Exactly. Chinese people are watching the FIFA Soccer World Cup, and they're seeing crowds without masks, and they must be wondering, why are we being locked down again when the rest of the world is moving on? It doesn't seem fair, and I think that is what triggered the protests. So far, I'm sure the authorities have been arresting people, but we haven't seen a massive, brutal crackdown like in 1989 on Tiananmen Square. Thousands of people were simply killed in order to crush the resistance. So I think, on balance, I think that is how it's going to play out. I think the Chinese Communist Party is going to stay in control. It's going to assert control brutally. But I'd be quite interested to see how it plays out if I'm wrong. Because how much instability would that create in China if the party was not able to maintain order? I don't think we'd see a burgeoning and flourishing democracy emerge within a year or two. It's probably more likely that we'll have instability and quite a lot of violence as well erupting. And I think that is the great fear of the Communist Party, of many Chinese people as well, coming from a country with such a long and proud history that suffered through instability during many periods. Stability does have a great value. So yeah, they are facing really serious questions in China, and we'll see how they play out in the next few weeks and months.
Of course, Russia's invasion has been a much longer affair than anyone thought it would be. I think when it was launched, the consensus amongst very large parts of the foreign policy establishment in the West in particular was that what this was going to turn into was some kind of partisan warfare with Ukrainians fighting against Russia in what would be kind of an almost Afghanistan type situation. But rather than that, rather than another protracted guerrilla war like we've seen so many so far in the 21st century, we've seen a very large conventional war, comparable in size to something like the Iran-Iraq War, or at some stages maybe even like little pieces of the Second World War, which and Russia has, by all accounts, seemed to have done much worse than many military analysts expected. What's your take on that?
Yeah, what I find so interesting as a consequence of the war in Ukraine is the effect that it has had on the rest of Europe, where Germany, for example, was a very pacifist country with a small army and negligible spending on the military, as well as a very pacifist Green Party. And the Russian invasion of Ukraine changed that at very short notice. The Germans have increased their military spending, I think, by 100 billion euros almost overnight. The Greens are at the forefront of demanding resistance against Russian aggression, and the country has been transformed. And I think that was not really what Russia expected. So I think Russia had a perception of the West as being quite disunited, quite weak, quite all over the place. And what has in fact happened is that the Western countries have stood together, have sent a lot of money to Ukraine, a lot of equipment as well. And I think it is this that has enabled Ukraine to resist for as long as it has. And we've seen also a very masterful propaganda war from the Ukrainian side, which has been quite impressive. Zelensky has personified, I think, leadership and resistance against the invaders. And what I also notice is the strategic use of dogs and cats being cradled by Ukrainian soldiers, to gain sympathy. It's very blatant, but very effective. And I think certainly in the Western European countries, in the United States, it has worked. We've seen the rest of the world, emerging countries, maybe not quite on board with that. as the West. But certainly Ukraine has been very effective, and I think the West has surprised Russia in terms of its response.
And of course, now we've also seen the recapture of Kharkiv Oblast and Kherson city, which were previously occupied by Russian forces. So it really, I think, the war is still very much in balance, which is not something that I think anyone expected to see back in February when the war began. It really seemed like more eventually Russia would win, and maybe it would cost them a lot, or maybe it wouldn't cost them that much. That was up for debate, but that Russia would eventually win the war. And I think now that prospect is far more murky than it was before, which is quite surprising. And I think
but it does
the
seem
last
to be
one
getting stuck in a sort of in a protracted war, as you said. I'm not seeing a quick resolution at this point. I don't think either side is at a point where it would want to sit down at the negotiating table
Right.
and come to a peace. I think each side thinks that it can still improve its position by continuing to fight. Therefore, it
No,
continues.
definitely. So I think it's going to continue well into next year, unfortunately. But anyway, our Iran, I don't know how much there is to say about that. These protests have been quite interesting because they were sparked by the murder or alleged murder of a Kurdish woman, Masha Amini, I think is her name, who was arrested by the morality police of Iran for incorrectly wearing her hijab. She then died in custody, and some of the inmates in the cell with her say that she was essentially beaten to death by the police. And this has sparked initially massive protests in the Kurdish regions of Iran, but that really spread to the rest of the country. And we've now seen these ongoing major protests, which have involved lots of quite striking scenes of women throwing off their headscarves and cutting their hair in public, of people attacking the Iranian clergy who run the country effectively in the streets. There's been a popularized trend on Iranian social media of people running up behind clerics, knocking their hats off, and then running away. Which is sort of really silly, but actually quite effective means of disrespecting them. And while there has been a lot of violence so far, the protests don't seem to have been crushed. There's also been a lot of turning off of the internet. Now, I know that authoritarian regimes have been very keen to switch off the internet ever since the Arab Spring played such a big role, had the internet played such a big role there. And the previous protests in Iran, it seemed to really damage their ability to organize. But this time, despite lots of internet disruptions, we're really not seeing the same effect. Do you have any thoughts on Iran?
Well, maybe some thoughts on the internet. We have these debates in the office sometimes on whether the internet is a blessing or a curse. And I think, like all disruptive technologies, it is a bit of both. On the one hand, it can be used to create social credit systems like in China and to monitor citizens' whereabouts and their activities and their transactions and interactions. So it's a very effective tool of control. But on the other side, it's also a tool of resistance, as we see in Iran and China to some extent as well. That is maybe harder to crack down on than we might commonly think. And my suspicion is that in the end, we're going to see it play out in a way that the internet and communication technology is going to be, it will favor, I think, citizens more than the state. And the reason for that is also because the benefits of this kind of technology in terms of online banking, online transactions, online services are so great that the states can't turn all of it off, because then, commerce stops. So it has to be kept going at some level. Maybe some parts of it can be shut down. Often workarounds are found to that. So it seems to me it is a democratizing tool in the end.
All right, let's move on to next year. And I guess the question is, and this is the way you phrased it in our brainstorming before this, was what unexpected things are you expecting to happen? Is there anything unexpected you think that's going to come out of the ANC's national conference?
I'd love to be surprised on that, but at the moment, I think that Cyril Ramaphosa is going to win the leadership race. I think he's going to be quite weakened, both because of Pala Pala and also because of his own personal declining popularity amongst voters, which we measured at 60% last year and at only 43% this year. So he's going to be a bit of a dead man walking, and he has to look out for his friends in the party, his comrades, who are going to have very avaricious eyes, I think, cast on him and his position. It's probably convenient for the ANC to keep him in place for a little while longer. He can become a lightning rod. If support should decline below 45%, maybe even below 40%, at least then you've got a guy to blame for it. Make it Cyril. He's the bad guy. And then whoever the new guy is can say, I'm different and I'm going to turn things around. So I think the surprise is not really on the election side so much, but maybe on the effects of who gets elected and how it plays out. I think policy is not going to change very much. No matter who gets elected, I think it'll be roughly National Democratic Revolution aligned, and that means more race laws, more weakening of property rights, continued cadre deployment, and continued hiding from accountability, and ensuring that there are no consequences for corrupt actions. So more of the same in that sense.
And what paths do you think the ANC has available to it now if it wants to actually rescue its electoral position? If the sort of trends continue, and they're not just, it's worth bearing in mind, they're not just things that we're seeing in polling. There have been some by-elections now where the ANC has gotten, I think, quite a fright, particularly in urban townships, where it's seen its vote share erode. If you were supreme leader of the ANC, what are the options do you think that would be available to you to try and rescue the party from the state it's in?
I think the first thing I would try to do is to destabilize the coalition partners as much as possible. That's sort of an obvious and cheap thing to do. So just buy off the 1 seat, 2 seat parties, break the coalitions, make them fight with one another, tell the public that you must never vote for an opposition party because they can't work together. And if you want stability and you want things to work, give us another chance as the ANC. The second thing I think would be to play on the emotional collection and just say, look, those coalition people are new parties, they are racist parties, they are a cobbled together collection of unappealing drunkards in a beer hall somewhere. So don't vote for them, vote for the ANC, which is respectable. It's Africa's oldest liberation movement. It brought you freedom, so give us your vote. And the third thing I think they could do would be to mobilize tax money in support of the government. And this is a kind of weird thing at the moment where you would expect a sort of quite state-centered party that is facing electoral defeat to deploy tax money. In other words, introduce the basic income grant, increase the existing grants, introduce the national health insurance, just give people stuff, give them money, give them handouts in order to just make it through one more election. I don't think it's too late for that change of tactic yet. I think Finance Minister Gorongwana has been a bit of an obstacle in the way to doing that. But who knows what middle of next year, end of next year will bring. Maybe by October we'll have a new finance minister, one who's a bit more compliant and a little bit more willing to spend money in the interest of the movement and the revolution. And the deputy finance minister might be the guy who seems to endorse modern monetary theory, the printing of money with no consequences, no bad consequences. So yeah, I think that would be one of those expected, unexpected things that could happen. Finance minister out, new one in, and lots of spending of money next year to make sure that the ANC stays in 2024.
That's very concerning. And I think probably connected to that sort of scenario, let's say major economic disruption, where we're left, we experienced these terrible riots in Gauteng, but mostly in KZN in 2021 in July. And there were a lot of interesting developments. We saw people of all classes and races defending their property from rioters. And at the same time, we saw a kind of nihilistic orgy of people, some who were desperate, some who were opportunistic, some who were just kind of going along with it for the ride, taking part in these really destructive, terrible riots. And we've long speculated about whether there might be more. Do you think that we might be facing some more sort of major riots like that? Will there be any riots big enough to maybe change the dynamics in the formal political system by kind of disrupting things from outside?
So I think we do think that there is a possibility, maybe even a likelihood of a repeat of July 2021. And the reason for that is that if you imagine a dashboard of factors which are conducive to such riots, I think all of those indicators are still in the red. And that would include the poverty, the joblessness, the inequality, the lack of prospects, lack of education, lack of service delivery. So all of these things are still bad at the moment. Plus, of course, the lack of capacity in law enforcement. So for those reasons, I think it is, the possibility exists, and it's not that unlikely. At the same time, also, the indicators are also negative for the ruling party itself. So when we try to think ahead to where electoral support levels might be for the ANC going forward, you think of the things that keep a party up in the polls, and most of those indicators are also in the red. So it's having resources within the party to pay your staff, to run election campaigns. The ANC doesn't quite seem to have that under control yet. It is having ideas. So have you got people developing new policies, exciting policies that people can buy into? Do you have leadership that can provide a sense of meaning and direction to the organization? And on all of those counts, the ANC is lacking currently. So I think it is probable that the ANC will continue to decline, and it is also probable that we'll see a repeat of the July 2021 unrest.
So when you've got, a declining major party like this, you've got the old wounded buffalo, to go back to the metaphor, sort of obviously showing signs of distress. Everyone who with any sort of political ambition, I think, is going to maybe take a shot, because this is the time for like a thousand sort of vultures or opportunists, or if you stop and talk to one salesperson in some places in Africa on the side of the road, very soon you'll have very, very many around you offering you their goods. And I wonder whether South Africa is about to experience the same thing, and I presume we'll see this in 2023. We've already seen three parties. One of them is a bit older, that being Action SA, which is obviously going to run for national and provincial elections next time. There's a number of small parties that did surprisingly well in the 2021 municipal elections. I'm thinking like sort of small odd parties like the ABC, various sort of weird independence parties, all sorts of people from all over the spectrum seem to be coming out of the woodwork. We've seen Mmusi Maimane launch a new political party. We've seen Sonkezo Zibi and the Rivonia Circle think tank group look to be launching a new party. They announced that officially this week, which was long expected. Are we going to see any more? There's been some talk also of having former Constitutional Court Chief Justice Mogoeng run for office. Am I correct to expect 1,000 more political parties before 2024?
Maybe. So I think the temptation is going to be there for such parties to be created as vehicles to satisfy individuals' need for status or income. But I also wonder whether that is a sustainable trend. So in other words, we might see it in these elections because we can see the fracturing of the politics and what looks like opportunities beginning to emerge, and lots of people going to try and make use of those opportunities. But in subsequent election cycles, I think it will turn out that these smaller parties don't really have legs, and voters, I think, are not going to be terribly keen on them. Like a one-man show, one-woman show. You say, do you really want to give your vote to that person? They might be around for only one term. Maybe they'll get one seat in parliament, but what are they going to do to represent my interests? How will they improve my life? So I think there's going to be a consolidation towards the larger parties in subsequent election rounds. But I think in these specific elections, yes, we probably are going to see quite a lot of new startups, political startups. Interesting that the startups that you've mentioned so far, I think, are mostly center-right. So Action SA, I think, could be described as such. Mmusi Maimane's Build One South Africa is probably center-right as well. Mogoeng, if he were to launch himself or a party, is definitely going to be center-right or maybe even right. And then the Rivonia Circle, I think, is not really center-right, but I think it is trying to distance itself from the center-left segment of the ANC, which has underperformed so badly. And that is an interesting development because it shows that political parties and actors, I think, are realizing the potential that lies in the electorate, which is probably far more conservative than our party political spectrum would lead us to believe.
So you say that a lot of these small parties you don't think will have legs beyond 2024, but do you think they might make enough of an impact in 2024 to perhaps affect the final electoral results?
Yeah, I think that could happen. We've seen like a one-seat, two-seat party break the coalition in Johannesburg, and that is definitely a prospect for the national parliament. If the ANC is below 50, whoever is in power is going to have to form a coalition. They're going to be small parties that are part of those coalitions, and that gives a tremendous amount of power to a very small number of individuals. So yes, I do think that these small parties are going to be significant in our politics between 2024 and 2029. And in our forecasts, our scenarios, we often speak of messy or unstable coalition politics between 2024 and 2029. And that is a likely outcome. I think there's definitely going to be quite a lot of messiness. You shouldn't expect a smooth sailing, a functional administration to emerge out of this, but maybe one with a prospect for improvement.
Yeah, I'm thinking some of those South American countries or Israel, perhaps, is what our parliament might look like after 2024. But yes, indeed, that remains to be seen. Any final thoughts you want to close off with before we shut up for today?
Yeah, what I would like to close with is that we tend to be focused on the doom and gloom, given the state of the country. And I remember 5 or 10 years ago, I was somebody who was always very alert to good news stories and would make a note of when I saw them and share them with friends and family. But for a while now, it's been hard to find them. It seems like every single story that emerges is of corruption or destruction or decline, degradation. And that is a tough environment to be in. It's also hard, I think, to keep your mood up, keep your spirits up when that is the environment you're in. But what I would like to suggest as an antidote and a counter to that is that South Africa has come to the point that it is at now through the results of the almost untrammeled exercise of power on the part of a single party. And that period is coming to an end now. So we can definitely say that the ANC is weakening, and it will probably be below 50 in 2024. It is not going to be as strong and as dominant as it has been for the past 28 years. And that opens up the space for improvement. And given what we know about South Africans from our polling, from our daily interactions, from the fact that we are an open and free and democratic society, I think there is reason for hope. The grounds are shifting, the old certainties are breaking apart, and out of the change emerges the opportunity for improvement. And I really hope that as South Africans, we manage to make use of that opportunity.
Definitely. And it's going to be up to us, I think, in a large way to make sure that the outcome is good and not bad, because we are on the sort of fulcrum of history and change here. But anyway, thank you, John, very much for your time today. I thought that was fascinating. And we will be back with A Daily Friend next year. Thank you, everyone. And I hope you all have a wonderful, wonderful day. Cheers.